You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do, a context media production.
Hi!
I am your feigning illness host, Abraham.
And I am your providing treatment when you don't need it host, Shane.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're a psychology podcast. We love to tackle all things psychology related, and sometimes that includes psychological diagnoses of certain kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into that, if you like this episode, if you would like to support the podcast, you can always leave us a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can join us on Patreon. And if you do that, then you get access to behind the scenes content, videos, show notes, discounts on merch, depending on what level at which you join, all that sort of thing. And so you can head over to patreon.com/WWD podcast. Also reach out to us on social media. Tell us about this episode, any other episode, like, subscribe, share the stuff, that you do.
Yeah. Anything you can do to support the show, like talk about us, share, all that stuff is super helpful. It's going to alter the algorithm, if you will.
Maybe you don't necessarily care all that much about like digital content. You're like, I don't need more videos or more audio and that sort of thing. What I really need is a nice ceramic cylinder in my hand. Well, we've got you covered there too, because we recently launched our merch store, and currently we have a couple of designs for mugs that we think are really fun. One says World's Best Psychology Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is a menu of podcast things that you'll find in our feed that Shane designed. It's very good.
Yeah. I have the thought as we talk about this, it's like, if you really want to support the show and also decide which host you like more, you can just order one mug or the other.
Yeah, there you go.
And if you like both of us, get both of them.
I love that. I love that plan. And then we are going to be putting up some shirts, and we're continuing to come up with more merch ideas also moving forward. So check out our merch store on our website. That's another thing that we can do.
Yeah, it's good stuff. We're really in the next couple of years trying to expand a lot more than where we're at. Not that we haven't reached your ears, and with love and care, we have done that, we hope. But we're definitely going to branch out a little bit and do some really cool, fun things.
Yeah, we got some cool stuff in the works. I'm excited to announce when we get there. But yeah, here we are. So let's talk about our subject today. And to start this, I would love to tell a story to help, I think, bring a personal connection to this topic.
Absolutely. So Kelly Turner is a Denver area woman who seemed on the surface to be a normal American Christian mother of a 7-year-old daughter, Olivia. And like many people in this country, Olivia seemed to have a myriad of health problems and even became terminally ill at some point.
So unfortunately, at just 7 years old, Olivia passed away from what was described as intestinal failure, as Kelly, her mother, Olivia's mother, had claimed it was this intestinal failure.
Now, throughout her daughter's illness and 5 years of treatment at the Children's Hospital, campaigns to raise money for her treatment pulled an estimated $530,000 or more to help pay for bills, to help support the family during this trying time. But there was a lot of money that was like pooled and put together to support this young girl.
Yeah, GoFundMe's, Make-A-Wish. And so if you do the math on this, that means that from 2 years old until when she passed away at 7 years old, she was basically consistently receiving these medical treatments. Now, if this weren't already tragic enough, this is a terrible story. Kelly's other daughters also started to become ill, and Kelly started seeking treatment for her remaining daughter's quote-unquote bone pain, which she said was caused by cancer.
Now, jump ahead to 2019, and we find Kelly in court being indicted on charges of theft, child abuse, first-degree murder, and 10 other charges. It seems like quite a leap, but there's a whole path on how she got there.
Yeah, some of those other charges including fraud and that sort of thing, and neglect. Now, is this an example of the system victimizing an already victimized family? Like they're just like going hard after Kelly and she had suffered enough? No, actually, this is not one where our underdog is the hero.
Right. So a cancer disease, any sort of cancer diagnosis would need proper assessing. But when doctors looked into her daughter's health, they actually found no indication of cancer, anything to do with bone pain related to cancer at all. So there was no sign of it, no trace of it in the remaining daughter.
Now, this is suspicious. So they also did an autopsy on her deceased daughter, Olivia, who we talked about at first. And the autopsy revealed no evidence of this intestinal failure as the cause of death, or really any other of the medical concerns that would have potentially caused her death.
And so, as this is going on, other records began to surface of doctors reporting that they had repeatedly recommended decreasing certain medications, certain treatments, and other interventions for Olivia because they were deemed unnecessary.
Right. And so essentially what was happening is that Olivia was receiving an enormous amount of medical intervention for things that she didn't necessarily need, possibly any of them. And eventually, Kelly Turner, this mother of these daughters, I'm not sure if she had other kids. It really only talked about the two daughters in the article that I found, the news article. Mm-hmm. But she pled guilty to at least 3 of her charges, including, I think, abuse or neglect maybe was one of them.
Although it has not been formally diagnosed, it was hypothesized that this could be a case of factitious disease imposed on another, or Fdia.
Yeah. In this discussion, we're talking about this factitious disorder imposed on another, what this all is, what are the criteria for it to diagnose it, and how someone could do this to another person.
Yeah, and so you are probably more familiar with this term as Munchausen by proxy. You've probably heard that term, and we're going to talk about where that came from. So we're going to get into the background of all that and also cover some additional public cases of this specific type of disorder, because it is one that, on the surface, it is so confusing to think about how somebody could experience this, how somebody could go through and follow through with these things. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to hopefully unpack a little bit of that today.
We'll do our best. And, we were just thinking about and determining that we were going to have this discussion. It's just such a unique sort of thing. And many people have probably heard of this or some form of this, but there's something going on here that I think is really hard for a lot of people to connect to. And I think you even hear the story of Kelly and you're just like, man, what is going on here? And we're going to do our best to unpack what we do know about this and understand that, unfortunately, this is not something that is super well understood, but it happens often enough to have a name. And as we mentioned, that name is factitious disorder. And then there's factitious disorder imposed on another, which I think is more or less what it sounds like. Getting into factitious disorder, understanding what it is, one thing that is helpful when we're ever doing diagnoses is understanding what it's not, because there are so many diagnoses out there. It's useful to distinguish one set of characteristics for a diagnosis from another to avoid any overlap. And that's, I think, also true of medicine. Like, there are a lot of different diseases that have similar symptoms to something else. And so having the right diagnosis is important. Okay. So one of the things that's not is malingering. Malingering is fabricating, feigning, or exaggerating physical, psychological symptoms to specifically achieve some desired outcome. So this is when people who will say that they're sick or will even cause themselves to be sick because it allows them to get out of doing work, to allow them to get access to money, to get some like tangible, specific reward. You might have someone who, if you ever saw the movie Gone Girl, spoiler alert, I guess, the movie is pretty old at this point, but if you haven't, then I apologize. But spoiling the fact that like someone in here who does a lot of basic self-injury, and it's to get access to things like there's certain outcomes that she's trying to get, basically. It allows her to get certain like power and privilege and in some cases money and attention, that sort of thing. But there's like a very specific tangible goal that is at play there.
You'll see the term malingering used a lot in forensic settings. It's a more specific term for forensic, like that type of thing. I mean, it is a thing that exists in other places, but you'll see that a lot in military settings, in forensic settings. That's a term that comes up a whole lot because there are benefits that come along with, getting like, if I have this illness, then maybe I reduce a sentence. Yeah. If I have this concern, then maybe I can end my time in the military and I can still get my pension and still get those benefits. Right. So there's a reason why it becomes so specific.
I've heard this too in like organizational settings, calling, someone malingering is someone who's like constantly calling in sick. So they just avoid work, that sort of thing.
Another thing too is we want to distinguish it from somatization disorders or somatoform disorders or somatic disorders or symptoms where you're not feigning, you're having genuine physical symptoms that through a process of exclusion can't actually be explained by a medical condition. So there are physical ailments, but there is actually no evidence as the etiology for whatever that is, whatever that ailment is.
I wonder, there's something called Morgalon's disease that I think we should tackle at some point. Have you heard of this one?
I haven't, actually.
I kind of wonder if that would fall in this category of somatization or somatoform, because it is a disease that is more or less characterized by the experience of a physical problem without any actual manifestation of the physical problem. I'd be curious to see where that falls in this because I haven't really done a deep dive. I'm just sort of peripherally familiar with it, so I'd like to learn more.
That sounds great. Let's add it to the list.
Okay. All right. So as we said, this factitious disorder and is better known as Munchausen disease and then Munchausen by proxy. And so this is, again, different from those other two because in this one, you could be feigning or actually inducing real disease.
Yes.
Or some kind of other illness, injury, abuse, or trauma. And specifically in this case, it is to gain usually attention, sympathy, or some kind of like reassurance or something like that to oneself or to someone else.
It was named after a fictional character, Baron Munchausen, based on a real 18th century German aristocrat infamous for his exaggerated, albeit amusing, improbable tales. Fictional Munchausen's some of his exploits include riding on a cannonball, fighting a 40-foot crocodile,
wow,
traveling to the moon.
That's impressive.
In the 18th century.
Yeah.
Swallowed by a giant fish in the Mediterranean Sea.
That one's very probable, though.
That one's probable. Knowing how the ocean is and the terrifying nature of the ocean and all those creatures, yes, absolutely.
But coming back from it seems a little unlikely.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole story about it in the Bible, but that seemed to work out for them. So it saves himself from drowning by pulling up on his own hair.
Because that's how gravity works.
Also, I feel like that's where like pull yourself up by your bootstraps came from. Enlists a wolf to pull his sleigh and uses laurel tree branches to fix his horse when the animal is accidentally cut in two.
Because that's how biology works.
Yeah. He sounds like a fun character to be around.
Man, if you could pull yourself up by your own hair, like what would be the point of ladders? You just grab your hair and just lift until you're up to the height where you want to be. Like,
well, I guess my question is how, like, do you pull up? Like, do you pull up or do you pull up like it's a rope?
Oh, I see.
I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I don't know either. Either one seems ridiculously improbable, so.
Where's Baron Munchausen when we need him?
Come on, Munchausen. In 1951, British physician Richard Asher coined the term Munchausen syndrome to describe patients who, quote, like the famous Baron von Munchausen, have always traveled widely, and their stories, like those attributed to him, are both dramatic and untruthful, end quote. And he characterized this primarily as them desiring to be the center of attention and interest, but there was otherwise no specific tangible or concrete reward or gain or anything else that they were getting from it.
That is specific to the idea of Munchausen syndrome. Now, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now termed as factitious disorder by proxy or factitious disorder imposed on another, was first coined in 1971 in a peer-reviewed publication titled Folia 2 in The Parents of Psychosocial Dwarves, 2 cases. Folia 2, also a Fall Out Boy record.
Right, yep.
But it also is the Folly of 2. It's otherwise known as shared psychosis or shared delusional disorders in which a symptom of delusional belief is transmitted from one individual to another. So if I'm starting to have a psychotic break, then I'm transferring over those symptoms to Abraham here, and then this podcast really goes off the rails.
Yep, this whole podcast has just been Folly 2. It's been off the rails for a long time. Just kidding. I am proud of what we've done here.
I am too.
Okay, great. All right. So in the case of this paper, there were these 2 sets of parents that had a shared delusion of having this sort of righteous parenthood. There's specifically circumstances of abuse going on, and it describes this child abuse in the form of psychosocial dwarfism in these 2 separate families, which one parent initiated the abuse toward the child and the other parent essentially condoned it, sort of a buying into the narrative of the sort of leader, fanciful person.
In this situation, we're going to talk about something called psychosocial dwarfism. Psychosocial dwarfism, reversible hyposomatotropism. I did that pretty good. Dwarfism.
Yeah, you did. That was good.
I took my time on that. So
yeah, that's the key.
Yeah. Abuse dwarfism or psychosocial short stature is a growth disorder caused by extreme emotional abuse, stress, and neglect, which mainly affects children 2 to 15 and can affect growth hormone development and secretion, physical stature, and cognitive development, some of which is reversible if the child is removed from the causal environment. So basically what this is saying is that with extreme abuse, neglect, harmful environments, and whatnot, it can actually stunt somebody's growth.
I was about to ask, it sounds like that this is like a real life description of essentially so much trauma being inflicted on another human that they fail to thrive and don't, and they end up being described as having dwarfism and not related at all to their genetics, but to their extremely tenable, I think, sort of rearing environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in this paper, there's the two families, the Kirks and the Greys, in which an adolescent boy and a young girl, so one family had a boy, one had the young girl, they were subjected to this physical and psychological abuse. For example, this might be hard to hear for some people, so just a quick warning. They were locked in closets for several days without food. They were disciplined using a belt for soiling themselves, even when they were only 4 years old. And so a lot of child abuse that was going on with these kids.
Yeah. Now, in both families, the abuse led to physical, social, and emotional delays, which perpetuated both sets of parents' views of their own roles as needing to serve as stay-at-home caregivers for their troubled children, especially the mothers in both families, with the husbands more or less passively complicit. And so as the author state, quote, whereas in Munchausen syndrome, the patient gives a false medical history, in abuse dwarfism, the parents give a false history while the patient remains silent. That is to say, one has a case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, end quote. And so that's the first kind of coining of that term in relation to this particular disorder.
Right, yeah. So this is how this all ties back to this Munchausen, is essentially that the parents in this case are getting special attention by having a troubled sort of home environment, even though they were the ones manufacturing that trouble. But it then gives them a lot of specific specialized attention. And this term further gained momentum when it was used in a paper in 1977, when a British pediatrician, Roy Meadow, described the sort of inexplicably extraordinary behavior of two mothers, one who had poisoned her toddler with excessive quantities of salt, which we'll talk about, I think, that or a related story in a moment, and the other one had introduced her own blood into a baby's urine sample, essentially saying that there was blood in the urine and there was a concern, but it was actually her blood. And so that continued to gain momentum with that term, with those two cases, again, leading to the fact that although this isn't very common, it's common enough to have a name that can be referenced in these settings in psychological published papers.
To kind of differentiate this, if you listen to the episode on clinical lycanthropy, that is not an official diagnosis. It's a term that's used because it doesn't happen enough for it to be considered a DSM diagnosis. But here in this scenario, this particular concern happens enough that it has a formal diagnosis and diagnostic criterion. So this kind of like illustrate where people think that they're werewolves not as often as people who make their own kids sick.
That's unfortunate, and I wish that those two things were switched.
I agree.
So that's a great setup too. Let's take a quick break for some advertisements, and then we'll be right back to talk about the criteria for the diagnosis. Okay, so we were just talking about the momentum that has gained in the term Munchausen by proxy, or Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Mm-hmm. So let's turn now to talking about the diagnostic criteria for having that label applied. And so again, we're talking now about what's called factitious disorder in the DSM-5, so the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Speaking of which, we have an episode on this, the history of the DSM. You should go check out.
Yep, and there's a revision coming up.
Oh, is there?
There's a TR coming up, yes. So there will be a revision in the year 2022. So at the time of this recording, this revision is not out yet, but there is a revision coming up in the next year.
Oh, I did not hear this. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is a diagnosis assigned to individuals who falsify illness in themselves or in another person without any obvious tangible gain. This is one of the important features of this. And the diagnosis for individuals falsifying the illness of another is where we get to this factitious disorder imposed on another. That was Munchausen and then Munchausen by proxy, respectively, now being called factitious disorder or factitious disorder imposed on another as the more contemporary terms for those.
Yes. So here are the diagnostic criterion for FDIA, and there are 4 primary criterion for this. The first is there is intentional induction or falsification of physical or psychological signs or symptoms. The second is that the individual presents themselves as ill, impaired, or injured to others. So they're always kind of presenting like, oh, I'm not feeling good. I'm not doing well. I'm sick, or here's some injuries that I've experienced.
Yep. I'm sick.
The black lung.
An important critical feature of this that the deceptive behavior persists even in the absence of external incentives or rewards. So once they've ruled out this is not just malingering to get out of something or to get some financial gain or something. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, an important feature of most diagnoses is that it is not better explained by some other mental disorder that would account for that behavior.
Yeah, and so factitious disorder can be diagnosed as either a single episode that can happen in a singular moment or as a recurrent episode, 2 or more instances of illness, falsification, and or induction of injury. So you'll see it can either be momentary, kind of a very specific short-term thing, or it can be a long-lasting type of thing occurring.
Now, comorbidity is a frequent issue that occurs in diagnoses, and they've done a lot to try and reduce the amount of comorbidity, but this does have some comorbidity with borderline personality disorder. And then I imagine everybody knows this, but just to be clear, comorbidity referring to the fact that it often, those two diagnoses would be found in the same person. I don't know what the rates are of comorbidity here. Like sometimes they're as low as like 20%, but high enough to be registered as like, we see that about 20% of people who have this diagnosis also have this diagnosis. And just to be clear, I'm not saying it's 20%. It's just referring to the fact that there's some overlap with other diagnoses here. And the one in this case is borderline personality disorder, which makes a lot of sense to me.
In a clinical setting, it's good to know what the rate of comorbidity is so that you can rule out those other things too, or be on the lookout for symptoms of those other things. Like that's primarily what that's used for. It's not looking like you've got Munchausen's, you've also got borderline. It's like, okay, so you're coming in with Munchausen. We should probably be on the lookout for traits that are related to borderline and rule that out if we can.
Yeah, that's a good consideration there. Speaking of symptoms, Shane, tell us about some of the symptoms of factitious disorder.
Yeah, so an adult with FDIA will often not leave the bedside of their child or person that they are caring for ever. So there is a lot of kind of entanglement there, what some people might describe as codependency, but the idea that there is that person really never leaves that sick or ill person's side.
You know, this whole section here, I think, could be called How to Tell If Your Neighbor Has Factitious Disorder Imposed on Another or something like that.
Yeah.
That doesn't really roll off the tongue, but
that's why I started saying FDIA. It's just way easier to say at this point.
But even then, like, still, I don't know. I think there is a little bit of like what to look out for. Also, important note always is that just because their symptoms are present doesn't mean that's what you're dealing with. It could be very legitimate that there's like a real medical condition. So just being really clear on that point. Another symptom to look out for is a mother who welcomes any kind of medical test, even painful medical test for their child. And it does say mother here, but it really can be any parent. So we'll amend that to say any parent welcomes any kind of medical test for their child. As we mentioned, they're constantly at the bedside. Another interesting sort of risk factor here is that this person has previous medical experience, but they might seem less concerned than medical staff about the health of their child. This is something that's actually seen with people who know what a lot of medical treatments are, and they're very familiar with the course of disease and that sort of thing, that they are in a position more well equipped, I think, to carry out this campaign of deceit for a long period of time successfully because they know what to look for.
Yeah, it's almost like there's just too much information within that, right? So and you'll see this too specifically in this next piece, right? So FDIA diagnosed adults will also discuss in extreme detail the symptoms and care that has been provided over this history. And typically that'll be used as evidence that they are a wonderful caregiver and they're doing a thorough job. What they'll do is they'll say, I took this kid to go do this and this and this, and we were on this medication and this medication and this medication didn't work and this medication didn't work. So we went to this medication and then we titrated this medication. They'll kind of like roll through this entire medical history, but they'll have so much detail and so much information that it'll be like, see what I did. See what I did as a caregiver. See how good I am as a parent.
Yeah.
And that's usually a pretty big indicator that like, oh.
I did find a source that actually specifically said, like, if they seem to know a bit too much about like medicine, medical procedures, and have like these extremely detailed notes, that could be a red flag. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean you have this disorder, but it is something to look out for that does commonly occur with this.
Yeah.
Another one that's interesting here that's important to note, and this to me is maybe one of the most critical pieces here, is if all of a sudden those symptoms go away when the person goes to the hospital, they take their child to the hospital, for example, but then the symptoms suddenly return when the caregiver is alone with their dependent, the person who's suffering. So they're like, you know, my child has this horrible disease. They take him in the hospital. They're like, they look fine. And they're like, yeah, I don't know. They were just doing this, you know, whatever. And then they take them home. And they're like, oh my God, the symptoms are back. That could be, I think, a huge red flag of like, if it only occurs in the presence of their caregiver, but there's no other evidence for it.
Yeah.
That's something to really keep an eye on.
That seems a bit suspicious, we'll say. Now, the child or dependent person has a history of many hospitalizations. Often the symptoms that they have are strange within those hospitalizations. They're not consistent, and you'll see that kind of thing too. Or it'll be a consistent thing that has been treated multiple times, but for some reason, this particular symptom or this ailment continues to return. It's one of those things that immediately your gut will tell you, like, this doesn't feel right.
Right.
This seems strange.
And so I think, the next two on here overlap with things that we've already said. One of them is that the symptoms are being reported by their caretaker, but not being witnessed by hospital staff or even other people in the family. And that the child, let's say in this case, the dependent, their condition or symptoms don't match the results of their other assessments and tests that are being done. They keep saying, like, you're telling us that this is, let's say cancer, but like every diagnostic we've ever run shows no cancer. So like, what do we do with that?
And that's not to say that those types of screenings and tests are perfect by any means.
True.
So like there have been situations where somebody might have had cancer and they were misdiagnosed. That does happen.
Yeah.
We're not really talking about those types of things. We're talking about specifically multiple diagnostic tests that yield no results, but the ailments and the symptoms are still continuing in significant ways.
Yeah.
Specifically, you'll see too that there might be blood and lab samples not matching the blood of the child or dependent person, which is pretty extreme.
Yeah.
But this is something that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody dumping blood into a urine sample or something like that, you might be listening and going, I can't imagine people do that. And Abraham and I are sitting here going, I couldn't imagine doing that myself, but It's something that does happen. It's reported happening pretty often.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's that. There's also the fact that, like, if there's a history of other unusual illness or deaths of other dependents or children in the family, that is something else to be on the lookout for. Is like, do we see a pattern emerging here? A pattern of behavior, a pattern of sort of symptoms on the part. And again, I just want to make sure we're reiterating this point really clearly. All of these things are indicators of possible harm of this diagnosis. And the fact that if you do have this diagnosis, like that this legitimately exists, that you're pretty much going to see a lot, if not all of these symptoms, right?
Yeah.
But it's just to be careful that just because you see these symptoms doesn't necessarily mean you could have a very legitimate medical condition where someone has all of these other things show up, and it just like, it's a coincidence that it happens to be that when they go to the hospital that they're feeling better. This is maybe a child or dependent who sort of cycles through how severe their symptoms are. Mm-hmm. Then they, as they get really worse, then that's when they take them in the hospital, but then they're cycling out of it and it doesn't show up. But there are red flags. And I think that's the way to think about all of these is these are red flags that mean investigate further. Maybe things are totally on the up and up and they're good, or good in the sense that they're legitimate, but there also could be this situation going on. And this is fairly rare though. So that was a lot. Do you think we should take a quick advertisement break obligation?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great.
yes, absolutely.
All right, we'll come back and we'll talk about some treatments for this right after this. Okay, so some people paid us to spend time so they could tell you about a thing they're trying to sell. We're going to come back now and talk about some of the treatments that exist for this factitious disorder and factitious disorder imposed on another.
Yeah, so at the time of this recording, there aren't really any standard therapies that are involved with this specific disorder. It usually involves a team of professionals, usually social workers, law enforcement, healthcare providers, foster care organizations, just to name a few that might be involved in these scenarios. And due to the main concern that in FDIA cases, there's a safety issue that goes along with the child or the dependent person. That's why you might see not necessarily a treatment team, but an interdisciplinary team that involves legal, law enforcement, and other community supports that are going to wrap around this person to make sure that these types of things do not continue to happen.
Right.
Now, the goal of having this larger team that usually is more structural, more support-based and not intervention-based, or I should say therapy-based, is to make sure that the safety of the child or the dependent is maintained. That is their utmost concern and the most important factor in these cases. And the treatment of the person with FDIA is secondary. Like getting that person the help that they need to treat that particular disorder is secondary to making sure that the safety of that child is maintained.
So coming back to the story about Kelly Turner and her daughters, the second daughter that was having this spontaneous bone cancer apparently has been removed from the home, is now a teenager, and is doing better in her current living situation with people who are not trying to poison her.
Yes.
It seems like that situation is doing okay. And again, because they prioritized her well-being over like trying to necessarily catch in this case, the mother.
Yeah.
And her contribution to this. Now, unfortunately, as we sort of said, there's not a standard therapy. And part of this is because this is rarely successfully treated. And part of the reason that that's the case is because the parents and caregivers are like just in 100% committed, constant denial that they have any kind of problem or that their accusations against them are legitimate. So success in these treatments can really be dependent on actually catching them sort of red-handed or in the act, or sort of creating a context in which they will admit to and tell the truth about the situation. And if you can get them to sort of face reality, admit to what they've done, and then start to make progress on that, then there's more likely to be successful with some kind of treatment. But these are people who've been doing this for a long time. Like they've probably been months and years of like committing to a lie and then creating a situation where that lie is supported by immediately observable, at least anecdotal reports and evidence. And so they tend to be really good at it. Like they get really good at lying and fabricating and thinking on the fly to explain what's happening. They do it so much that they're not really even consistently, even internally to themselves, telling the difference between real and not real, like what's fabricated and what's sort of real. And that becomes even difficult for them to be able to tell the two apart.
Yeah, so it's important to note that if you're approaching somebody who you think this might be going on, or to approach somebody who this might be a concern, that taking a non-judgmental approach can be the only way to get that caregiver to seek or attend to treatment for this. Now, the thing is immediately, if you say somebody has this, no matter if they have it or not, they're probably going to be defensive because it suggests that they're not a good caregiver, right? Which a core fundamental value of this disorder, people that have this think that they are the caregiver of the year. Yeah. So you're already challenging a core belief they have. So it's really important to recognize that you're probably going to go into this with a non-judgmental tone, with some kind of facts, maybe some concerns, maybe some information, but the treatment that gets put in place here is going to focus on managing it. It's not going to cure it.
Right. Yeah.
Which is true of most psychological treatments.
There's quite a few, yeah.
Yeah, you're not looking at a cure. You're looking specifically at managing and living with this particular concern.
Yeah. For attempting to provide some kind of treatment or management, they'll tend to go with medications that are specifically for treating things like anxiety, mood disorders, personality disorders, if applicable. And that's sort of a way that they might go about trying to help manage this, is targeting things that they feel like are related by using similar medications. And that's not a terrible idea, but it's also, again, you're in the realm of not necessarily treating, you're in the realm of like, let's try and prevent this from continuing to be terrible or getting worse.
And you'll see this kind of type of approach too, where you're talking about managing and kind of reword or rethinking the way this is going on through psychotherapy, right? So you'll see that some folks with FDIA will go into psychotherapy with the focus on changing the thinking and behavior of whatever's going on with that particular disorder. Now, and this is usually done through CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or something to that effect. Now, the goal of that therapy for anybody who has FDIA is to help the person identify the thoughts and feelings that are contributing to that behavior, right? Identifying, I'm having this thought, I'm having this emotion, I engage in these behaviors in relation to those things, and to learn how to form new relationships that are not associated with others being ill. How can I get attention from people without having to make my kids sick?
Right.
You know, there's a lot of different ways to kind of go about this and rethink this, and we're not going to get into all the strategies with that, but this is one way that people will help manage this disorder.
I think that we can hypothesize a little bit what we do understand about other treatments where I think that they might work here. We'll get to that toward the end of this discussion. One of the other things that's important here is just thinking about how to change that person's overall sort of at-home, normal daily routine and context. And part of this is going to involve things like sticking to a treatment plan, right? This is going to a therapist, going to doctor's appointments, following the medication, that sort of thing. It does occur to me that a little bit of this treatment recommendation sort of looks like it just turns into factitious disorder for that person. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, I still want to harm people. Give me all the drugs.
Right.
And so there's still there's the potential for that, I think, but I'm not sure if there's any concern about that. If they're like, as long as you're not like actually hurting people, then we're okay.
Yeah.
Unclear. But having someone who functions as a medical gatekeeper for them, someone who's there to manage the medical care, to check that they're following through with treatment, that they're connecting with others, that they're having those close relationships, can help sort of move them in that direction and remind the person with factitious disorder of how relationships ideally would go that are not dependent on fabricating medical history lies to gain sympathy.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about some other sort of like pop culture things where this has occurred, because likely, as I said, most of our listeners will have heard of this in some context. So just for fun, we'll talk about some of the ways that this has been portrayed in popular media and whatnot. Dee Dee Blanchard, mother of Gypsy Rose, was the focus of The Act on Hulu and Mommy Dearest, Mommy Dead on HBO. And Dee Dee Blanchard was accused of abusing her daughter Gypsy Rose because of this factitious disorder imposed on another, Fdia, or Munchausen by proxy. The daughter that was abused, again, Gypsy Rose, got her boyfriend to kill her mother, who abused her in 2015. And we have a YouTube video linking to this as well.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah. For those of you who may or may not have seen the movie The Sixth Sense with Haley Joel Osment and Bruce Willis, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, one of his first or second movies ever that he did, in my opinion, arguably the best movie he's ever done. Mm-hmm. In this movie, I think this came out in the 90s, but I guess I'll say spoiler. One of the characters can see and interact with people's ghosts, and it's the little kid. And at one scene, he basically goes to this wake where he talks to the ghost of this dead little girl, who shows a video implicating her mother as poisoning her to basically keep her sick. And that girl ends up dying, and her other sister is coming down. Is actually, unfortunately, like really not that different from what we were hearing with the Kelly Turner story at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
But that was the scene in The Sixth Sense. It was like 100% hitting all of the markers of what would be at the time described as Munchausen by proxy, now the Fdia that we've been talking about today. But yeah, that was not a factual scene, but it carried through all of the descriptions of like the symptoms and the actual effect of what happened, or I guess what would happen in an Fdia situation.
Yeah, especially a situation that doesn't get treated.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So rapper Eminem, bet you didn't think that he was going to show up here.
I did not.
He has spoken about his mother and how his mother would frequently take him to hospitals to receive treatment for illnesses that he didn't have. Specifically, his song Cleaning Out My Closet includes a lyric regarding the illness. Quote, "Going through public housing systems, victim of Munchausen Syndrome, my whole life I was made to believe I was sick when I wasn't until I grew up and blew up." End quote. And his mother's illness resulted in Eminem receiving custody of his younger brother, Nathan, as well, because this apparently was so severe. And there are other things that were going on if you know the history of Eminem and all that. But he ended up with custody of his brother over all of this stuff.
Yeah. So if you, as a point of warning, engaging in Fdia with a child could result in them becoming the next Eminem.
Oh, God. I like Eminem. I think Eminem's great.
No, I'm just being funny.
Yeah.
In 2014, 26-year-old Lacey Spears was charged in Westchester County, New York, with second-degree depraved murder, which I did not realize that was a charge that anyone could incur, as depraved murder, as opposed to like, thoughtful murder.
Sophisticated?
Yeah, sophisticated murder, yeah. And was also charged with first-degree manslaughter. So essentially what happened here is that she gave her sons dangerous amounts of salt after she conducted research on the internet about the effects of high amounts of salt. Her actions were allegedly motivated by social media attention that she gained on Facebook, Twitter, and on blogs. So she was convicted of second-degree murder on March 2nd, 2015, and got 20 to life in prison for that.
We've demonstrated that the Fdia diagnosis is fairly rare, but it's dangerous and it's deadly. And while these are situations where people were charged and there is an actual paper trail, there are plenty of other kids that are probably experiencing this that aren't anywhere near this. They're probably just constantly sick and their quality of life is probably horrible because nobody's getting caught. And, so it's important to note that.
I was going to say probably one of the other things to consider here is that this might be a lot more common than we think. And it's just that it doesn't ever reach the point of getting so severe that there's death and subsequently an investigation. But it's hard to know. Like, we generally are going to want to take people at face value when they're talking about the health of their kids, because most people are going to be genuinely trying to ensure the safety and well-being of their children. And so it's really hard to know when these people, particularly, they're just hyper fluent liars and fabricators and in a way con artists. It's hard to know. Like, there's red flags to look out for, but again, they might be doing it. It might be so subtle that it can go on for just a really, really long time without anybody catching on or being the wiser. And it not end up, if it doesn't result in a death, then you might have someone who it goes on until that dependent is sort of out on their own, or if they're maybe an older person, then they would pass away. It seems like of a natural aspect of their condition, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to know how prevalent it really is. Hopefully not very, but let's talk about some other things that we understand about what might be going on with this from a sort of scientific and psychological perspective, as well as other hypotheses we could throw at in terms of what to deal with this. It seemed like a good time to take a quick ad obligation.
Yes, I like that.
All right, great. So we'll break for just a minute when we'll come back. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into talking about what is going on here in terms of understanding this from like as the most brutally scientific perspective we can take. And I think hypothesize understanding what we know about these treatments, about these sort of things, other things that might work.
So when we were kind of going through the research on this and looking at the current studies that are out there, we haven't really found any research on ABA and FDIA specifically. There are loads of articles regarding CBT, which we talked about in the psychotherapy part of this, but there's nothing really about behavior analytic work within the FDIA realm. And so that's something to just kind of consider as we enter into these other hypotheses that we're going to talk about.
Now, there is this sort of hypothesis that is where this begins. And there is the hypothesis that this can start when a mother is pregnant, particularly if it's a difficult pregnancy. And this results in like a heightened level of very specialized, careful attention from medical professionals, family, friends, etc., like people who really then get sort of elevated on a pedestal of like really special, sympathetic care and attention in the situation. And what then could happen, and again, this is not going to be everybody, but for some people for whom they're sensitive to this, that the kind of reward and dopamine hit of attention that comes from that attention, that can increase their desire to report illness or problems with the child of the pregnancy. And then they just get used to this sort of like, oh, well, if I play this up a little bit, then I get extra attention. Or maybe even if I just express fear about it, like, oh, they weren't kicking when I thought that they should be. Can you just take a look? And then the doctor's like, you're being a great mother because you're really concerned, but everything's okay. And they're like, oh, well, as long as I'm being a great mother.
Yeah.
And then you can see how these things, they start small, but with enough contact with the successful attention that they get, then it's sort of like they unaware of how they're doing it. They just start to ramp up a little bit. And they start to say the child is sick once they're born, obviously. They say they're sick when they're not necessarily sick. They bring them in the hospital when they don't necessarily need to come to the hospital. And essentially, in all of these, and this is part of the definition of this diagnosis itself, what we're looking at is someone who's just trying to get special attention for this, right? Because again, one of the important features is that FDIA does not have any other tangible motive. It is that they're just getting this attention for the situation.
It's sad because as we're studying this, I'm just thinking of a particular person in my own life that this was a real thing.
Oh no.
While during their pregnancy, they were in the hospital something like 17 or 18 times. They were not a high risk pregnancy, but they would always feign symptoms and end up spending a full night in the hospital.
Wow.
16 times during the pregnancy. It was not a difficult pregnancy by medical nature, but they ended up causing a lot of problems.
Oof.
So it was one of those things. Now I'm looking back, I'm like, wow, I am really glad that I have custody of my kid. So
who could you be talking about? I don't know.
Who could I talk about? I have no idea. Now, there are other reasonable hypotheses for how to maybe help somebody. If we could make the assumption that attention is the reason why somebody might be doing something, then giving somebody specialized attention ahead of time before they start engaging in these types of behaviors would be really beneficial. You can kind of give somebody ongoing, regular attention, specialized attention, maintaining appointments, teaching people how to request that type of attention. Those are different ways that you can intervene to prevent this from getting worse than it is. Unfortunately, the problem is that some of these behaviors are so subtle and so covert that it's difficult to capture until it's showing pretty egregiously. Like you're seeing it happen really bluntly. So while we might have some possible ways to work with this, we just don't know because we don't have the research to say one way or another.
Yeah, exactly right. And yeah, just as you were saying, and you think you said that extremely well, is thinking about like, okay, if they're just trying to get attention for doing something inappropriate, well, maybe we just give them like highly specialized attention for no reason at all. And so that they wouldn't have any reason to seek it out at that point. Right.
Right.
And then anything, I think, where you have someone, and this is sort of mentioned with a medical gatekeeper, if there's anyone who is sort of at high risk for this, if you had someone who could kind of just be there or some way of monitoring the situation so that there was no way to fabricate, as a greatly reduced method of being able to, or opportunity to fabricate these, that you wouldn't be able to have the opportunity to engage in some of these behaviors that would then result in that specialized attention, right? So it's like sometimes there's like these automatic medical devices that can't be tampered with that just sort of do an ongoing running report. And unless they flag something specifically, you're not going to necessarily get any specific attention. That might help reduce this. And I think that will become a little easier as technology continues to evolve and develop.
Yeah.
That I think is just another thing to consider here is, and again, I don't think any of these have necessarily been explicitly tested, but this is reasonable given what we understand about how behavior works, that those might be strategies to reduce the occurrence of this without getting into a reactive, like, well, we'll just wait till it happens and then throw them in prison sort of thing. We don't want it to happen. So let's prevent it.
Yeah, we don't want it to happen. Absolutely.
All right, we have a few other interesting tidbits for you.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some fun things here. The first thing is in Australia and the UK, they have established a legal precedent that Fdia does not exist as a medical legal entity. So that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
So you've got somebody who might be engaging in these types of behaviors that are really problematic, obviously based on what we've demonstrated here, and now there's no legal precedent for it. So in 2004, the Supreme Court of Queensland state, quote, as the term factitious disorder, i.e. Munchausen Syndrome, by proxy is merely descriptive of a behavior, not a psychiatrically identifiable illness or condition, it does not relate to an organized or recognized reliable body of knowledge or experience, end quote. So essentially what they're saying here is that by the legal standings and proceedings, it does not exist, but the behavior does. So what they're doing is they're kind of reframing the way that they're approaching criminal cases that go along with Fdia and saying that you can't say that you have Fdia when you engage in these behaviors. You're being charged for these behaviors specifically, end point, right? So that's really what they're saying is they're taking out that legal recourse to say, like, guilty by reason of insanity, essentially, is what they've removed from this situation.
Right. Okay, so we talked about that 1971 paper, the Folie à Deux. That's also a Fall Out Boy album.
Uh-huh.
Important to know. Good album, incidentally. Yes. I'd recommend it. That paper, again, was about the parents with the psychosocial dwarfism and the two cases. Now, interestingly, the first author of that paper, John Money, was actually the doctor who recommended sex reassignment for, if anybody's familiar with the case of David Reimer, or maybe Raymer. That's also a story worth digging into more in depth at some point. But the short of it is, this was a kid who had a botched circumcision. It ended up destroying most of his penis as an infant. And so they decided to, apparently John Money's suggestion was reassign his gender as female, and they tried to raise him as a girl. So he spent the first several years of his life being raised as a girl, decided that that did not work for him later in life.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a thing worth digging into later. But yeah, interesting overlap there.
Yeah, that's probably a whole episode in itself.
Yeah.
And the last little interesting tidbit of this specific thing, Munchausen by proxy, in the movie Yes Man, did you ever see that movie?
Yeah.
With Jim Carrey?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was pretty good.
Yeah, it was funny. I would recommend it.
Yeah. The band Von Iva appeared as a band called Munchausen by Proxy, and they were led by Zooey Deschanel's character as the singer. So there's a little fun little tidbit as far as that goes. I always think it's funny, like, bands later wouldn't use their real names. In, like, in Ace Ventura, Cannibal Corpse is the band, and it's very clearly Cannibal Corpse.
Oh, yeah.
But here it's like there is a band, and they just changed their name instead of just giving them notoriety.
I wonder if that was like a writer's decision or maybe director.
Yeah.
I don't
know. Maybe a whole episode on that.
Bands changing the name for movies. What can we dig up about that? I think that's what we have to say about this disorder. I think it's an interesting one. It is, I mean, this is, as far as we can tell, it's rare. Hopefully it's very rare, but it's really difficult to diagnose. And that's a huge problem with understanding both the prevalence as well as relevant treatments and causes and how to manage it. But that I think is a big take home point, is understanding that it's subtle, maybe more common than we think, but hopefully very rare.
Yes, absolutely. My big take home with this too is that it's ultimately a disorder that is incredibly problematic and has a lot of red flags, but is kind of masked by the fact that some people have medically complex disorders or challenges. You know, you have some folks that have really complex, undiagnosed medical ailments that require a lot of different testings, some of them being painful, and sometimes people just want to find out what's going on so they can adequately treat it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In those cases, it's difficult to say that it could be one or the other, given that there is probably some kind of medical ailment going on. But unfortunately, you know, people go into these situations and they're distrusted because of how many times they go to the hospital and all stuff because of a disorder like this. I imagine somebody who's truthful about this stuff probably has a really hard time getting the help they need because of stuff like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, if anybody could recognize this in themselves and seek help, that would be tremendous, significant contribution, both to themselves and potentially the person they might otherwise be victimizing, because this is enormously abusive and traumatic to the recipient if it is the imposed on another or by proxy version of this diagnosis. I mean, it's terribly traumatic to even the person if it's just them imposing it on themselves. But like, these are often people who, like, they can't advocate for themselves. They don't know any better when we're talking about kids or people that have disabilities or elderly, and they're essentially being tortured, like using establishments, you know, medical professionals and stuff, to just absolutely wreck their lives. And it's just so tragic. And so it's a really sad thing. Treatment of this is really difficult for FDIA specifically. But it's always important to remember the real victims of this, and that these are people who have lost their lives or become severely disabled from this abuse and trauma that they suffer.
Another take-home point of this, too, is that this disorder has a lot of comorbidities with other mental health diagnoses, specifically bipolar, borderline disorders, narcissism. And you'll see this that makes it a little bit more difficult to pin down, too, because there are so many other intricacies that go along with those overlaps.
Right. All right, well, I think that's all that I have to say about this. Do you have any more on factitious disorder?
Nope. I feel like I want to hear more stories from Baron von Munchausen, though.
Yeah, that does sound like like that could be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, well, then I think that we are going to have a non sequitur transition to some very unrelated and yet still fun recommendations.
Recommendations.
Okay, I am recommending the TV show Ozark, which is on Netflix, specifically season 4, part 1, because that was just recently released. There's going to be a part 2, which is pretty obvious when you finish part 1. There are 8 episodes in this part 1. I mean, the whole series, I think, is really, really good. I think for anybody who's curious and has seen other sort of crime, sort of drug shows related to this, it's similar to Breaking Bad in that way. But it's really its own thing, and it's very, very well done. I really enjoyed it, and I think season 4, part 1 so far has been good. And so that is my recommendation. Shane, I'm given to understand you're recommending some numbers.
I'm recommending some numbers that might translate into something really cool. So I am recommending an album.
Okay.
You know, it's been a little bit since I've recommended an album.
Has it been a week?
It's been a week since I've recommended that last one. This album is called 1111 by a band called Pinegrove. While it is not something that is blistering metal that will tear your face off, like sometimes I do recommend, this is a nice little quiet, mellow indie record. It's something that you would listen to while you're out in the forest. Now, if you're familiar with Pinegrove, this is their 6th full length. They put out Marigold. They put out another album called Skylight, which was really great. Cardinal, which was really good. But this is a really good, nice kind of easy, quiet, mellow, just a wonderful kind of emo indie rock album. So I definitely recommend listening to it if you're trying to relax.
Ooh, I like that recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought you would. I had a feeling that when I was like, I'm listening to this, I'm like, Abraham would like this.
Yeah. And I mean, I like me some good metal, but I can very much appreciate some nice, easy listening as well.
Yeah, there you go. A Renaissance man.
Sure. Sure. All right. If you have factitious disorder imposed on another and would like to share your story with us, I am so sorry, but we'd also be interested in sharing it if you would like to. If you would like to tell us about a TV show or an album that you're into, we're happy to share those, at least hear about them as well. You can reach out to us on social media and definitely at our email at info@wwd.podcast.com. You will reach one of us and we will talk to you and it will be great.
Yes.
I'd like to recognize that this podcast could not happen without the special help of some special people doing special things for us, starting with our Patreon supporters, which includes Amanda, Kathleen, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and the Daily BA as people who help make this show possible. Thank you all very much for your contributions. You get some extra goodies coming your way for being so great. In addition, my team of people that are required to make this happen, we've got Justin, Amber, Shane, Selena, Kyle, Allen, and then thank you so much to the writer of and putting together of these notes today, which was primarily Britt Bowerly, and Alan also helped a little bit with this one.
Yes.
Thank you both very much for your contributions. Thank you everyone who is listening to us today. Shane, have I forgotten anything? Do we have anything else to say?
Nope, I think that sounds good.
All right, thank you everyone. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.
We love to talkle.
Have you been playing Wordle?
No, I haven't.